You are listening to ESG News and Views from the Conference Board.
Hello, this is Paul Washington, Executive Director of the Environmental, Social, and Governance Center here at the Conference Board. Today, we're bringing you a special edition of our ESG News and Views podcast that will focus on the COVID-19 or coronavirus health outbreak. As we record this, there are over 40,000 cases of coronavirus concentrated in China, but now reaching over 24 countries across the globe with over 1,000 fatalities. A health crisis like this not only calls on governments to respond, but corporations as well. The current outbreak is garnering attention from across the C-suite as people are grappling with the financial, human resources, communications, and other aspects of this crisis. Today, our focus is on how corporate social responsibility professionals at companies across the globe are marshaling resources to respond to this health crisis. I'm delighted to be joined today by two of my colleagues here from the Conference Board, Jeff Hoffman, Institute Leader of Corporate Citizenship and Philanthropy. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you, Paul. Happy to be here.
And I'm also delighted to be joined by Anka Schrader, Senior Researcher in Sustainability at our China Center. Anka, welcome.
Hi, Paul. Hi, Jeff. Pleasure to be here.
So, Jeff, let me start with you. How does responding to a global health crisis like this differ from a response to a more discrete natural disaster like a hurricane or an earthquake or something of that sort?
The components of how a company responds are the same. It's really the timing of it that is different, because here in California we have an earthquake, you respond, you recover, and move on, and hopefully the aftershocks aren't too strong. With a disease such as this and how it spreads, it starts small and it gradually gets big and it attracts more attention, and people begin to think about it and respond in different ways. So a response, if you look at the different aspects of a disaster with preparedness, prevention, response, recovery, rebuilding. You start with the response in the area where you're seeing the virus happen, but at the same time, you can be preparing for it in other areas as it begins to expand, and then beyond that is how do you prevent it. And I think that's what we're seeing around the world right now. Even though there are isolated cases outside of China, there's a lot of prevention activities going on. And then if you look at some of the big health organizations around the world are really focused on prevention so it doesn't spread.
Thanks. So it sounds a lot more complicated in many ways, because you're doing a number of things all at once. And then, Anka, it also seems to me that on top of that, it might require an extra degree of nimbleness, frankly, in that it's not clear how this is going to progress overall. Will it be quarantined? Will it run its course? If so, for how long? And what will the degree of impact be? And will it perhaps even become something chronic? So what do you think about the need for sort of greater flexibility as this unfolds?
You're right, Paul. There's definitely a greater need for flexibility in the response to this crisis, especially over the longer term. The situation is obviously changing daily in terms of data reliability, government requirements at the national, but also at the local levels, all the way down to the street level. Sometimes, you see differences in requirement and necessary responses, hospital requests, and international restrictions. All of this is in constant flux at the moment. There's really a lack of information. At the same time, there is an overload of information. Much of what is floating around on social media right now is unverified. Some of it is false. Obviously, we're seeing a lot of fake media, and this is causing a lot of unnecessary anxiety and uncertainty for everyone, including businesses, and how they should respond in the longer term. And as Jeff mentioned, another layer of complexity is really around the different stages of crisis management that we're at different locations within China and outside of China. So part of the country really, and part of the population within the country is still in a crisis mode. While in other parts of the country, there's a strong push to get back to work, to get the economy back on track, and to normalize things. So this is where, we're going to be seeing a lot of overlap in responses and, a lot of need for flexibility and nimbleness going forward over the next weeks and months.
Right. And I guess you also highlighted another way that this is challenging in that it's unfolding in different stages in different places, which makes it more challenging for governments as well as for corporations to communicate a sort of consistent message. So, Jeff, this is not the first time that we've seen a health outbreak like this, although, as a recent report from the Conference Board points out, we expect that the current outbreak will have greater impact than SARS did back in, I think, 2003 or so. But what are some of the lessons learned from SARS and prior crises? What's relevant from prior incidents, and what may be different, do you think?
Yeah, there are many things, many learnings that we've had from SARS, bird flu, Ebola, and other disease outbreaks that have taken place over recent years. Probably one of the most important things, and Anka alluded to it, is the facts, the news, and what is happening. And I think the first thing that should be done is take the sensationalistic out of it and step back and look at who your company is, what are your core competencies, and how you can best address what the situation is. With some of the learnings that we had, with those diseases is pulling together a group within the company, cross-discipline, that are bringing together not only the corporate citizenship professionals, but obviously communications, which is critical, and human resources, because you have employees that could be in the affected areas, but you also have employees who are wanting to do something to respond. Finance, operations, and look at it holistically from a company perspective versus responding independently from different areas. These diseases and the outbreaks are complicated, as you said, in order to respond to. But I also think, as far as how companies do use their core competencies, is critical. If you look at some of the big corporations that are global, that touch health, either in actual healthcare providers, pharma, medical supplies and equipment, they've been through this before, and they do have learnings, and how either they're sending supplies into the areas that are currently affected, but they're also working right now to prop up clinics that they think in areas that are soon going to be dealing with the patients. So it's a lot of good learnings from the past, but at the same time, every outbreak is different. The location around the world makes a huge impact on what are the existing resources on the ground, which then affect what the response is.
Great. That's really helpful, and including emphasizing the need for this to be a team effort. So let's focus in on the corporate social responsibility function a little bit. And Jeff, you touched on this somewhat, but Anka, from your perspective, how are companies' CSR functions responding in general to this crisis? And then we'll get into some more specific questions after that. But in general, how are companies' CSR functions addressing this?
They're addressing it in a number of different ways. They obviously are feeding into the work that other departments are doing as part of a larger departmental crisis group, as Jeff already said. This is one of the key things to set up, and most companies have done so. And so in this regard, the CSR team is feeding into ensuring well-being of employees, focusing on business continuity, issues like that. But then obviously, critically, we're talking here about emergency relief efforts that companies are engaged in. And we've seen really an overwhelming response from the corporate sector, I really have to say, in China. There's been an inpouring of cash donations by Chinese companies. Some have set up special funds for support of relief efforts. There's a number of channels where companies can contribute to funds that are set up through international organizations like Direct Relief is one example. Give to Asia has a specific fund set aside. Global Giving has a specific channel. So these are all ways to contribute and which companies are utilizing. Then we've seen a huge amount of equipment and supplies being donated, especially to overcome production shortages at the beginning for medical supplies, but also for logistics and distribution bottlenecks. If we look at some of the numbers here, they're quite staggering. Just in the first 3 weeks of this, so basically, well, not really if we count all the way back, but let's look at that. Let's look at when this really started to be in the news. So the 3 weeks that led up to February 11th, we saw almost 2,000 companies donating about 24 billion RMB. So that's, if you convert that into US dollars, that's roughly $3.4 billion. These were mainly cash donations. And this is a significant amount of money in a very, very short period of time. This is almost, well, I think maybe even a little bit more than a quarter of all corporate donations that were made in 2018. So that's a huge, huge amount of money pouring in a very short period of time. Another area where we've seen a lot of activity is the launch or the adjustment of products and services to meet special needs of customers during the virus outbreaks. There's been a number of companies that have, for example, provided specific online services. We touched earlier upon the need for factual information, that there's a lot of misinformation out there, a lot of false facts, and so online platforms like WeChat and Weibo, they have both launched services to inform their users of rumors on a daily basis. So this is one example. There are other examples where, for example, private hospitals have started offering specific services like home visits, remote consultation, pharmacy delivery services. So there's a whole range of responses here going on that have happened very quickly and have scaled up very quickly.
That's really impressive. Let me just follow up on a couple of those things that you mentioned. You talked about trying to distinguish between accurate and false information. So how are companies generally able to do that? Because they're not necessarily in a position of having firsthand knowledge. Are most companies and their CSR departments referring people to the World Health Organization or to the CDC? But how does a company that may not have the capabilities of discerning, what's true on the ground and what's not, help filter the information and respond to false information that their employees or their customers may be exposed to?
There's a variety of different ways in which they can go about doing that, but I would say generally it's a matter of identifying the sources that are most trustworthy. Obviously, we start with the very official sources, so these are government sources. It can be local government, so national government sources coming from China. It can be the World Health Organization, other international organizations. And then we move on to the types of news services or organizations that provide information that we consider trustworthy, partners that we have worked with before that we consider trustworthy. And I think a lot of it is about communicating with the broader community amongst professionals and with the broader network that you have to ensure that you have a list of reliable sources for your employees, and that you share that with your employees to also avoid people turning to alternative sources that may cause a lot of anxiety because they're spreading a lot of false news.
Thanks. That's really helpful. So, Jeff, you were, as I mentioned at the outset, you were just in Europe, and I'm wondering if the response here varies much by region. I mean, Anka listed an impressive array of what companies are doing, from cash to in-kind contributions and so forth. Is Europe responding differently from the United States or from Asia? Although clearly the response in China is more intense. Just curious on your perspective on that.
I would say that Europe is approaching it very similarly to the rest of the world outside of Asia. Actually, I should exclude Africa in that because there is a lot of concern with if the disease hits Africa, it will spread quickly. So there are a lot of efforts to on the preventative side to do everything we can to make sure that the disease does not get onto that continent. I would say Europe is very similar to what we're finding here in North America with the big multinational corporations and how they are helping. Again, is a lot of it is what Anka was talking about, which with cash, which is the easiest way to get immediate help into the affected areas. But again, what do they do as a company? It was interesting meeting with our European Council, Corporate Citizenship Council last week to hear them talk about how they are looking at their supply chains and who are suppliers that they work with that might have things that can be used by some NGO around the world that they don't have themselves. So it's a more creative way of looking at helping. But then when you look at what these companies are doing, from using transportation and logistics and partnering with companies that make medical supplies or pharma or food, I think one of the most interesting things I have been seeing is how a lot of the fast food companies, or at least those are the ones that we have been reading about, are providing delivery services in the affected areas because people aren't supposed to be out and about. But I think the biggest takeaway that I saw both in Europe and here in the United States is about collaborations. It really does take a group effort, looking at who has what and where it is and where it needs to be, and quickly is something that companies need to work together on, and we are seeing a lot of that.
Thanks. So that's really interesting. So it sounds like it may not be the response may not be as regionally based as it is based on the capabilities of the company, and clearly, though, cash is something that many companies either directly or through their employees can help provide. Which brings me to the next question. Anka and Jeff, take turns answering this if you like. Who is spurring the response here within companies? I mean, there's always a little bit of a delay that happens as companies sort of come to grips with what's happening on the field, as they sort through what they may be able to do to help. But who's really initially serving as the catalyst for the response here? Is it employees? Is it customers? Is it coming from the government, from management, from the board? Who's really causing companies to act here? Anka, I don't know if you want to take that first.
I think there's obviously a combination of stakeholders involved here. Addressing employees' concerns, to me, obviously plays a central role right now. They're in the midst of it. Public opinion is another major driver. There's also, as you mentioned, government. There's strong government expectations here at the moment that businesses really need to do whatever possible to help contain the crisis. So this can take a variety of different forms. It could mean that you are contributing, or that you're expected to contribute to immediate crisis response, through cash or in-kind giving, other measures, more the traditional response. But it could also mean that you're, expected to provide other measures, like we've seen, companies offering postponement of monthly lease payments for commercial tenants, to kind of release the pressure on smaller businesses, for example. So, all of these measures are kind of expected of businesses, and a lot of it is driven by government expectations. So working closely with the local government counterparts to really understand at the local level what needs to be done and what the expectations are is really, really crucial. And I think another crucial aspect is that this engagement really happens at the C-level, and that is perceived as sincere and firm.
Right.
And building on what Anka was saying and taking it from the perspective of multinationals that are outside of China and how they're responding, oftentimes in the early hours of a disaster, you hear your employees saying, what are we going to do? And oftentimes that is in response to what's in the news. And sometimes you actually have the same response coming out of the C-suite and communications, because they're looking at it as, that public perception that Anka had mentioned, which is so critical. Oftentimes the corporate citizenship professionals are acting in a moderating force, working with the other groups within the company to stand back and really look at what the situation is and when does it make the most sense to react. Obviously CEOs are very, very interested and involved in what a company's response is going to be, but it's actually that next layer or the next layer below that down that has the plans in place and who are monitoring the situation very closely. So it is a challenge. That's why I referred earlier to have a multidisciplinary task force within the company who is the C-suite champion there to make sure that the C-suite is aligned with what is happening within the rest of the company. Obviously, the final decisions are usually made at the C-suite level. The board, oftentimes depending on the magnitude of what the situation is informed. I wouldn't say that the board gets real involved in the decision-making aspect of what happens from a corporate citizenship perspective, but of course the board would be getting involved when it has major business implications.
That's really interesting. So you talked about the multidisciplinary task force internally, and I think it's really interesting that you see the CSR function, whether they're officially taking the lead or not, they really can help serve to moderate or regulate or guide the response of a company here, because they've got experience having done it before, and they've got a sort of neutral perspective on it, and they're not just looking at it from a financial or business standpoint. They're not just looking at it from a communication standpoint. They've got a sort of a broader perspective that takes into account multiple constituencies. So I think that's an interesting point, Jeff. Thanks. So let's turn to insights for what's ahead coming out of this, and let's first talk about this particular outbreak. For dealing with the coronavirus, what advice would you have for companies today? What should they be doing? What should they be avoiding as we go ahead with this particular outbreak? Jeff and Anka, do you want to share your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. So I think the two key areas for me here, one is risk awareness. So this is really around how companies are more broadly incorporating CSR risks into management, into risk management plans. So this is one area that I think is kind of a key takeaway on where companies can make immediate improvements. And then the other area is really to start thinking and acting long term. I think there are many people that still place too much emphasis on immediate considerations. It's understandable, and right now, obviously, we're in a phase where many companies are still in a crisis mode. But obviously, after that comes a critical part where we need to look at prevention, mitigation, and adaptability. So these are kind of the areas that are often forgotten once the immediate crisis is over. And taking a step back as a business, once we're kind of through this immediate phase and looking at those and where we can make improvements and maybe even investments. And we were talking earlier about collaboration and partnerships and where those may be feasible to tackle those areas better. I think this is something that businesses really need to think about and take away from this.
I couldn't agree with you more, Anke. In fact, it's the next phases that are often forgotten and unfunded, under-resourced, where really the biggest impacts can be made for the long term. If you look at Ebola, for instance, this was really devastating for many of the communities in Africa, which were ground zero for the disease. And the economic impact on those areas, in many ways, is still being felt. So going in, looking at how you're going to get a community back on its feet and functioning is critical. Same way with the company, getting back on its feet and functioning, that, business continuity and resumption aspect. And a lot of that is tied to the community and the employees as well. You need to have your employees in the affected areas be well, have their families be well, and also have some sense of normalcy. So they can go to the market, the schools are open, all of those things that you would often take for granted from a company perspective, but your employees need to have that normalcy in order to be able to go back into the workplace. So looking at that whole ecosystem around the employee is critical. The same thing goes with suppliers for the company. Until you have the suppliers back on the feet, you can't actually do some of your business. So it's that long-term view that I think is really important, but then also really looking ahead is the prevention. How do you prevent these types of diseases from spreading in the future? Because if you look at it from a humanity perspective, you want to prevent loss of life and the terrible things that people are going through and the quarantines and all of that. But from a business perspective, too, how you work towards preventing disease spread, going to Anke's point about risk, is critical, too. I mean, when you see major businesses that are shut down, you go, wow, when they're shut down for a day or two, and now we're talking weeks. That has huge implications. So I think the prevention side, the preparedness side, going forward is something that companies can spend more time thinking about.
That's really
and
helpful.
Paul, if I may add one final thought. Kind of just looking at the glass half full rather than looking at it half empty. I really do think that once companies kind of move beyond these initial stages, that looking at this as an opportunity for innovation can also be critical. All the things that companies are implementing right now, like flexible working, video, online communication, online services that are introduced, all of these experiments, they not only serve to improve the resilience of the organization, obviously in a time of crisis, but they can also become a permanent feature of the working environment, or they can change business models. And this can be a great opportunity to explore this and to test alternatives going forward.
Thanks very much. So I think that's terrific. What you've done is you've not only talked about what companies should be thinking about in responding to this particular crisis as they look ahead, but what they should be looking for in general in addressing future health crises, including preparedness, risk management, making sure that it incorporates CSR, making sure that it incorporates epidemics, looking at ways of learning from this and actually helping to drive innovation, whether it's relating to the supply chain, how companies deal with their workforce, and build in some additional resiliency. So I think those are really helpful insights. With a final question, if for those who are listening who work at corporations and are wondering whether they're doing enough or whether they're on the right track, what are some of the, other than the conference board, any other places where companies can turn to for some benchmarking information?
In the United States, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Corporate Citizenship Center has what they call the Disaster Tracker. It is real time that companies go in and put in what they're doing. It's public information. You can look and see what is taking place. It is a good opportunity when you're thinking about what your own response is going to be, what others are doing at this point. Here within the conference board with our councils, we do immediate benchmarking. We'll set up calls so people can talk real time about what is happening, and out of that could come collaborations, which we have seen. So a lot of really good things that are happening just within our own organization.
Terrific. So look, this has been, I think, a great discussion. I think a number of the key takeaways is that this is a particularly challenging situation. It's multifaceted. It requires companies to do many things at once in terms of their normal response to some sort of natural disaster. It requires them to be flexible. It requires them to keep calm and assess their capabilities, to marshal an internal team that CSR can help lead and keep on track. Requires them to collaborate with other organizations externally. It's important that a company's response be authentic. I think that's a really vital point, and that's true whether it's a company's sustainability strategy or its response to a crisis like this. And the companies should be thinking long-term, both in terms of their response to this epidemic and in response to, in anticipation of future ones. And so thank you, Jeff and Anka, for this. And I want to thank all of you for listening today to this special podcast. Please listen to more of our podcasts on this channel, ESG News and Views, and wherever you find your podcasts. Also, please go to www.conference-board.org to find other content about the global implications of the coronavirus on businesses and on society, and how companies are responding to this evolving health crisis. Thank you very much.
This has been ESG News and Views from the Conference Board.